Okay, today we're doing a bit of a public service report on a hidden infrastructure crisis that's quietly affecting pretty much every community in America. We're going to break down this really eye-opening report called the Negro Geography of America, and it investigates the slow collapse of our final resting places.
Right off the bat, the report's conclusion is, well, it's pretty startling. It says that the very ground we've set aside for eternity is, and I'm quoting here, a crumbling asset. This isn't some sudden disaster. It's a slow motion collapse that's happening right under our feet.
So how on earth did we get here? Well, the problem is baked right into the fundamental business model. Just imagine you're a landlord. A tenant pays you rent one time, and in exchange, you have to maintain their apartment forever. That's the deal a cemetery makes. And as you can probably guess, it's a promise that is mathematically almost impossible to keep.
And this brings us right to the heart of the issue, the broken math of forever. The entire financial engine that was designed to keep these places running for eternity has just completely stalled out. The system that was supposed to guarantee forever is something called a perpetual care fund. Here's how it works. When a burial plot is sold, a little piece of that sale, say 10 or 15%, goes into a trust fund. But here's the critical rule. You can never, ever spend that original money. Only the investment income, the interest or the dividends, can be used for things like mowing the grass. What's really fascinating is that this financial model literally shaped the way our cemeteries look. You can see this evolution away from the beautiful, complex, but expensive to maintain rural cemeteries of the 1800s to the wide-open lawn park model, and finally, to the memorial park, where all the headstones are flat against the ground. The whole point of that evolution? Making it as fast and cheap as possible to mow the lawn. But even with super efficient mowing, the model hit a fatal snag. It's what the report calls the paper-rich, cash-poor trap. See, a cemetery's trust fund could be worth millions on paper if the stock market is doing well, but, and this is a huge but, if that fund is invested in stocks that pay really low dividends, the actual cash the cemetery gets to pay the bills can shrink to almost nothing. So the cemetery looks wealthy, but it literally can't afford to pay the landscapers. Let's just walk through the math for one single grave that was sold back in 1950, where just $10 went into the trust. Okay, so in 1950, that $10 generated 30 cents in income, which easily covered the 25-cent mowing cost. Great. By 1980, with high interest rates, it was actually making a healthy profit. But then, the model completely breaks. By the year 2000, costs are way up, yields are down, and now we're running a deficit. And fast forward to today, that deficit has become totally unsustainable. That one $10 investment from 1950 now costs the cemetery $4.10 every single year. It's become what's known as a toxic asset. The only way to cover that loss is to sell new graves, which creates this subsidy system that is absolutely doomed to fail the second the cemetery runs out of land to sell. So, what would it actually take to do it right? According to the report's financial modeling, to fully fund the perpetual care for a single grave sold today, the cemetery would need to put $142.85 into the trust. That is a huge difference from the $10 they were setting aside decades ago. So what happens when the math finally gives out, when the money runs dry and forever ends? Well, the report has a name for it, the abandonment cascade. And it follows this really predictable, tragic pattern. First, the small volunteer board that runs the local cemetery just gets old, and there's no one to replace them. Then insolvency hits. The money's gone. The nonprofit corporation dissolves, and the property is left in this weird legal limbo. It becomes an orphan cemetery. And finally, in many places, state law actually forces the local town or county to take over, which turns this private failure into a public, taxpayer-funded burden. So how can you tell if a cemetery near you is in trouble? The report suggests a pretty simple diagnostic tool that anyone can use. They call it the grass height audit. Okay, so if you walk into a cemetery and the grass is neatly cut, but the headstones are all tilting and sinking into the ground, you are looking at structural insolvency. It means the trust fund is generating just enough cash to pay for mowing, which is often the bare legal minimum of care, but it has absolutely zero money for the skilled, expensive labor it takes to fix a sinking monument. And what if the grass is long and the stones are hidden? Well, that's the final stage. That is total abandonment.
The financial engine has completely seized up, and even the most basic maintenance has just stopped.
The report makes it very clear that this crisis doesn't affect everyone equally. Some cemeteries get what's called genealogical gentrification. Basically, if a famous person is buried there, it attracts volunteers and private donations that help keep it maintained. Meanwhile, historic African American cemeteries, which were often underfunded from the very beginning, are falling into ruin at a disproportionate rate, with some being completely erased from the map.
Now, you might be thinking, isn't there some kind of federal oversight for this? The answer is no. It is a complete patchwork of state laws. So in a state like Ohio, a township is forced by law to take over a failing cemetery, which can be a huge burden. Then you go to Texas, where a county can take one over, but they rarely do because it's so expensive. And then you have some innovative places, like Connecticut, which adds a tiny fee to every death certificate to create a grant fund that helps towns with the maintenance costs.
But you know what? This isn't just a story about decay. Faced with this crisis, people are coming up with some genuinely innovative ways to reinvent the whole idea of a resting place.
One of the biggest shifts is the move towards green burial. Think about it. The old lawn park model needs constant, expensive mowing forever. The green burial model, on the other hand, lets the land go back to being a natural forest or a meadow, so the maintenance costs actually go down over time. The money from burials can then be used for ecological restoration, turning a financial liability into a self-sustaining nature preserve.
Probably one of the most surprising solutions comes from the historic Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. They have a total operating income of over $2 million a year. And as you can see from this chart, a pretty big chunk of that comes from a very unusual program they call the Canine Corps. That Canine Corps brings in over $200,000 in revenue every single year. And they did it by turning the cemetery into a private, members-only dog park. I'm not kidding. Local residents pay a yearly fee for their dogs to run off-leash among the tombstones. It might sound a little strange, but according to the cemetery's leadership, that one program literally saved it from ruin. And that's not just a one-off thing. There's a cemetery in Illinois leasing out its unused land for a solar farm, which generates almost $70,000 a year for maintenance. Others are hosting yoga classes, movie nights, historical tours. The core idea here is revolutionary. The only way to sustainably fund the care of the dead is to make these spaces valuable and useful for the living. So, after going through this entire system, what are the big things you should walk away with? Okay, first, the math behind perpetual care as it was designed a century ago is just fundamentally broken. It doesn't work. Second, when these private organizations fail, the bill for their forever promise is falling squarely on local taxpayers. Third, we might really need to rethink what a respectful resting place looks like because the perfectly manicured lawn is just not financially sustainable. And finally, the most hopeful part, the future of these spaces depends on transforming them from static places for the dead into dynamic community assets for the living. And all of this leaves us with the one central question of this whole crisis, a question that every single community is going to have to answer eventually. How do we honor the dead without bankrupting the living?